Hey guys, we're going to be looking at some 95 theory. Let's get started. And I mean 95 is in the main line, 1195 instead of the topple dragon, which will arise after knight takes d4. The old main line, 95, intending to go to the outpost square on c4, whereas the new main line, knight takes d4, would be the topple dragon. So let's get started. 95. So, we've already talked about this, right? The plans for both sides. At a very general level, white wants to trade the darks for bishops, black wants to sack the exchange, white wants to push the h-pawn down the board, black wants to exchange the knight and attack on the queen side, right? So does it matter how you implement this plan? Well, it does. As we've already discussed, starting with bishop h6 is not great because black has the rook takes c3 exchange sacrifice, so let's not do that. What else is there? g4, I think it's just essentially unnecessary, but also, here's a good rule of thumb. Never play g4 when black has a knight still on e5. And here's the reason. The reason is black has b5, and well, I mean, this knight's a little bit overloaded defending the b5 square and the f3 square, and so white just doesn't have time. I mean, he's just not first at this pawn storm, and black has ideas like b4, a5, a4. It's just fast. Now, generally speaking, white wants to capture those pawns. Like if black plays b5, we'll just take it and say, hey, I got an extra pawn, your sack isn't so sound, but if black can take on f3, this undermines white's pawn chain. So when black's knight is on e5, we do not play g4. We wait for black to exchange with knight c4. Okay, so if we're not playing bishop h6, and we're not playing g4, what else is there? Like maybe h4, for example? Nothing wrong with that. It's just highly committal. It's highly committal because black can play h5 now, and at least this structure is more of a commitment than just moving the king b1, because pawns can't move back. And black, for example, would almost never play h5 if white hasn't committed to h4 yet, because maybe white can support g4 with like h3 and g4, for example. And then we get a free open file without needing to sacrifice material for it. So after h4, h5, there's lots of theory here. And I'm not going to say white can't fight for the advantage or fight for the win, or that I don't prefer white, because I do. There's like a lot of slow plans, but the key idea here that I want to illustrate for why I prefer not to play the immediate h4 is that if white does the typical double pawn sacrifice, it's just a lot of a commitment, the usual moves. I'm going to go through this quickly, it's just really typical stuff. You'd want to take here, because to exchange without gain is a mistake, right? Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, to take is a mistake. I would rather black take me, because that improves my queen, rather than improving black's position. But here it just doesn't work, because he trades the queens with an extra pawn. So that's why the king would rather be on b1 for one reason. It stays off of that open diagonal, and off the half-open file. So white has to take here, and okay, these positions are fine. They're fine. They're more than fine, actually. I don't know, rook h4 is kind of interesting, and maybe a new idea that I wasn't aware of before. g5 still giving white the advantage. Actually, white's probably having the advantage even here. I didn't like it as much, mostly because in these positions, I had the impression that white was having this excellent plan, but that it's really important to have the king on b1 because of this tempo is just useful for preventing counterattacks. Why? To be perfectly honest, I don't know why. I just, the difference between engine equality and engine white's winning seemed kind of interesting to me, but I would imagine that in some positions there would be a hanging c2 pawn with tempo, bishop a4, maybe e5, and there's a lot of counterplay still, and that actually matters. Whereas if white had like an extra free tempo, he could, this would not become with check, and white would be in time probably for ideas like knight g3, bringing the queen to f6, and playing for mate. But anyways, to keep a long story short, white's doing fine in these positions, but I prefer to be flexible and keep all my options in reserve. First of all, because if I could play g4, then I don't need to sack all my pawns and go for a position where hopefully my attack is winning, or at least enough compensation. I know I'm going to get enough compensation by sacrificing both pawns, but do I know that it's winning? I don't know that. It's a lot kind of complicated, and black has already weakened his position with this move pawn to g6, so I would imagine, just conceptually, that I should be better as white. I should be better as white because black has weakened his position, so I don't want to go for these unclear positions unless I can avoid it. Like, if I play king b1, for example, well, c2 is never hanging, this diagonal's never hanging, and if they play knight c4, then after exchanging, white can play g4. Now that the f3 pawn is not under attack, You don't need to worry about this knight on d4 being overloaded, so black can play b5, but only as an unsound sacrifice. And white still has this free roll attack coming along. Bishop h6 is coming soon. So that's the key idea behind king b1, which I'm recommending. I'm recommending king b1 as the most flexible move, preparing either h4 or g4 depending on what black plays. And so some people play knight c4. We're going to get back to this. What other options does black have? Black maybe plays rook e8 or maybe a6. Okay, let's try to see this in order. There's lots of different orders we could cover this in. So, trying to think about the best way of doing this. Okay. So let's start with b5. b5 is a completely unsound sacrifice. You just take it, and bishop takes, a6, knight a3. In all the positions, you generally want to bring the knight back to a3. The reason for this is it protects the c4 square, and black just has no ideas. We're still going to play down the h-file and essentially play for a win that way. Knight c4. You can go for these fun tactics, but you don't need to. It's just that you have an extra pawn, and you always have this knight a3 option. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's just another unsound sacrifice. Black generally wants to play b5 in the lines where he plays knight takes d4. Because, let's say the top blob dragon, for example. Black plays b5 here because white does not have a knight to take the pawn, at the expense of improving white's center control. Nishikiri also goes for lines kind of like this. Or, I would, as just explained, when white's played g4 and the knight is still on e5, black can play b5. So otherwise, the sacrifices are unsound because you bring the knight to a3, which defends on c4, and black does not have any targets. Okay, so what else is there? We could start with rook e8. Yeah, I'm going to start with rook e8. I think rook e8 is the most instructive. Same for a6. It doesn't matter. The idea behind this is if they play some semi-waiting move, then you get to play h4. Oh, is it lagging? Okay, h4. And as a result of, well, white's wanting to play h4 to h5 as a pawn sacrifice, and as we've seen from Karpov versus Korchnoi, this type of sacrifice is very, very dangerous, even crushing, essentially. If they take with the knight, you play g4, bishop h6 is coming, it's practically checkmate if white plays well. So black generally would like to prevent it, at least at grandmaster level, with pawn to h5. But then after g4 takes h5, this type of sacrifice is very dangerous, and as we've already explored, white, generally speaking, gets more than enough compensation, especially if we have this extra tempo on king b1. And this idea of having waiting moves, like black might want to do a waiting move, because if white plays g4, then black can always play b5 with counterplay. Sorry about that, that was just my roommate. It's all good, by the way. I'm totally okay with having a little bit of background noise in here, because I'm not trying to pretend to be perfect or anything. If anything, maybe people will actually enjoy a few bloopers here and there. Anyways, these sort of sacrifices are strong from the general point of view, because there's two open files against the opponent's king, white has the bishop on the long diagonal, and we have lots of other attackers. This is related to the concept of the assault ratio. How many attackers you have relative to defenders where you're attacking. And here white has 5 attackers relative to 2 or 3 defenders. This is a more than favorable assault ratio, by the way. Hal used this to determine whether he, or gauge whether he had a strong attack or not, whether he could sacrifice. And this is also congruent with Agard and Colin Crouch's 3-piece rule, where you need 3 pieces to have a successful attack, 1 to sacrifice, and 2 to give mate. Right now, we outnumber black by around 2 or 3 on the king side, and we're going to open more lines soon enough. So, from the general perspective, I really like these positions. From the concrete perspective, we've avoided the tactics already discussed because we get off the king off of the open diagonal. And I guess we could look at a few lines, like bishop f6, knight d5, trying to chop that bishop off. We have all sorts of ideas coming up, probably with a decisive attack. Okay, king h7, bishop takes g7, something like this. And there's lots of ways white can play with more than enough compensation, but I really like this typical knight f5 sacrifice. It's often strong because if they take with the g-pawn, you get to invade with the queen. And after bishop takes, it's like, objectively, this is essentially winning or very, very close to it. There's ideas like knight d5 or g1, but just at least you can see at a general point of view, black has a very exposed king, and white is including all of his pieces in the attack. So what other options does black have? Let's say bishop h6. Let's see, what else is there? Maybe knight c4? Well, then we can just take it, and then we can take it, and then we can sacrifice all of our pieces and checkmate the opponent. Pretty simple. And I'm going to go back over this again because the idea of, once the bishop reaches h6, the idea of sacrificing the bishop the rook on h5 with queen g5, or taking on g7, often just leads to an absolutely decisive attack, and black needs to defend, and he is not able to. So let's say something like e6. Yeah, I wish there wasn't noise too, but I don't plan to like wait until perfect circumstances to record all the time. Okay, g3, rook takes h5, takes. This is one example. Another typical sacrifice. Rook takes h5, removing the defender. The knight is not able to defend. The rook will be included. The dark squares are weak. The bishop's on this diagonal. That's one of the points of e6. So rook takes, knight f5 again. These typical sacrifices. White just has way more attackers than defenders on the king side, so you can afford to throw a few pieces in the fire. Okay, and very strong attack. Absolutely crushing, actually. You're pinned. You're getting crushed. I'm sorry. All the pieces are coming in. So, okay, so what else is there? This is just illustrative lines mostly. Like, unless you're a master, you're probably not going to get this deep, but for the most part. And if you are a master, then maybe you'll want to use Chessable to draw a few theory lines. Let's see, what's the most relevant here? I think this is probably the most relevant. Rook g1, bring all the pieces in the attack. Queen f6, takes. He doesn't have this trick anymore, because, actually, let's talk about that. Because if queen f4, just rook takes h5. We've removed the defender, and extra piece. Luckily, we've moved the king. When in doubt, play king b1. Anyways, what was it? Was it Ben Feingold always play king b1? Ben's awesome. He's so much fun. Anyways, queen g7. We just retreat. And there's lots of ways white can play with just a dangerous initiative. What's the pawn count, right? Well, it's not a pawn? Ha. Well, this is going to be a very scary attack. You can just swap it off. Play rook h3. Bring the queen in. Go for checkmate. Probably there's other ways white can play too. And White's won almost all the master games from this position. Probably most notable is Judith Polgar versus Kaitanov in 2010. I'll just insert that game real quick and go through it, just to show what could happen. A lot of ways White can win, I'm sure. But, yeah, Black was pretty helpless. And this is a cool queen sacrifice. Once again, Ferguson Gambit strikes back, and after rook h8 check and rook h7 checkmate, the game is over. So let's go back. I know I went through that very fast, so I'm going to summarize the key ideas. The key idea is White wants to play h4, h5, even at the cost of a pawn sacrifice. White does not want to play g4 with Black's knight on e5. The double pawn sacrifice, meaning g4 takes an h5, is very, very dangerous, but is usually stronger when paired with king b1. And waiting moves don't save Black. He absolutely needs to hurry. I consider rook e8 to be a waiting move, and mostly because g4 could be met with b5, but also a6 is a sort of a waiting move because you can play b5 next if White plays something too slowly. The problem is with the king on b1, this double pawn sacrifice has been prepared, and it's the exact same idea with a very, very scary initiative coming up. Yeah. Wait, what? Magnus Carlsen? He played Black here 3 times? Oh yeah, well that was 14 years ago, so no wonder he lost 2 and drew 1. I mean, they didn't know this was basically losing for Black back then, I'm sure, because 2 pawns is 2 pawns, but, you know, time tells, I suppose. Okay, what else is there? I'll cover knight c4 soon. Knight c4 is the key move, but what else is there? What can Black play that's reasonable? a5 maybe, but like threatening a4, but it's not even really threat. It's sort of a fake sacrifice, but we don't care. Just play a4. In general, we can always meet a5 with a4 in the dragon, and also in lots of Sicilians, and White is usually better in these opposite side castling positions with this pawn structure because Black cannot continue the pawn storm, and especially because we control the b5 square. We can afford to give them an outpost because they still have no other way to break through. Something like knight c4, bishop c4, rook c4, and even b3. Yes, weakening the dark squares, but it doesn't matter because Black cannot access them. He doesn't have any way to open the position, and White is just going to checkmate Black. Probably objectively, White is winning. Okay. Anything else? Nothing serious. The dragon's not too serious, is it? Okay, anyways. Okay, knight c4. Let's take a look at knight c4. That's what Black intended when he played knight e5. So, knight c4, bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, g4, and that's kind of interesting. Queen d3 is apparently a fun... Anyway, that's a weird second best engine move I've never looked at. But I don't think you need it. g4 is just a strong idea, and Black is the one who needs to prove he can defend against this attack. It's just too strong. So as a result, Black tends to sacrifice a pawn with b5, at least at master level. It's not sound. We'll get back to that. But first, let's go back to alternatives. Queen c7. h4. You can also play a g5, knight d5 if you don't want to let them stack the exchange, as we've already discussed, but white already has such a favorable version that you don't need to worry about this. The pieces are just so active and the pawn storm's already rolling. So, okay, you're just going to play for mate. It's pretty simple. White's much, much better. Black has weaknesses. And okay, g5, knight d5 is simple. Because, yeah, I don't want to allow the exchange sacrifice. And typical idea, exchange for the knight. And if they take, they give you the file. Okay, so queen b8's the same. You can just play h4. You can almost always afford b3, even if it weakens the diagonal. Okay, so let's say it doesn't matter. They have no threats. Okay, too many ways to play. Okay, so b5. b5 is the critical move. b3. Okay, by the way, b3 is not force, and it may look pretty unintuitive, because if you just play b3, aren't you weakening the long diagonal? And you are weakening the long diagonal. And you actually can't afford to play differently. Like h4, I think, was Negi's recommendation, and there's some theory here, and I don't know what the theory is, but I think white's probably doing well. The engine seems to like white. Negi seems to like white. I would like white also. I think g5 is also supposed to be fine. This is just a bad position for black. But black is trying to get counterplay, and he's trying to justify his whole knight e5, knight c4 plan, so b3 is a relatively committal move, but the idea is you don't want to take the b5 pawn quite yet, because black's rook is pretty active. If you play b3, then it kind of blocks the open file that you're going to play after you take the pawn, and if he moves the rook back somewhere, then he doesn't have queen b8 anymore. It's just unsound. Okay, we might as well continue the line, because, you know, there's some open files over here. Let's say queen a5, a4, protecting the knight, a6. And knight d5 is a key tactic. It's not that hard to remember. It's like knight takes d7's in the air. And sometimes black has king f8 in these positions with an in-between move, but he hasn't moved the f8 rook yet, so white's just getting a much, much better position here. Something like this, and there's different ways white can play, but I mean, even if you just choose to take on d6, white has how many pawns? Let's see. That's it, 3 pawns and the initiative for the piece. White would be much better. Those are going to be very, very strong pass pawns pretty soon. Black has to watch out for various skewers. The bishop will be hanging in some positions. The rook's coming to d1, and okay, there were other ways white could have played too, like going for a counterattack, and if they take it, then you can go for this. It's like, there's a million ways to play. The key I'd move to remember is knight d5. I wonder, actually, if you play knight d5 here, yeah, probably this is also working. I'd imagine that white would also have a good position here. Material advantage, and it's just unsound. So I guess black has a few tricks. They just don't work. So let's see, what other tricks does black have? Rook c5, defending your pawn? Well, okay, I'm sure you can find it. So let's pause and try to find the best move for white here. Since Cameron was having a snack, I think I will too. Okay, knight e6, knight e6. Discovered attack on the rook. Bit of a fork here. Let's say he takes with the bishop. Then you take on c5, and he can't take back because you take the queen. Defended by your rook. So let's say something else. If takes e6, takes into a, well, e5, and then he's losing the bishop. You could also play g5, but it's not quite as strong, because after knight e8, your knight's hanging, so, sorry, not there, you take, and then bishop takes c3. So I'd rather just not have the knight hanging at the end of the line. That's why I'm playing e5, and it's just a winning tactic. So rook c5 loses to tactics. Probably club players are not going to get this deep into theory for the most part, and masters will have no problem memorizing or finding moves like 96. Okay, so I'm trying to cover the bad moves first. It's a bad position, but there's at least one practical try for black, and it's this move pawn to b4. This is known as the burnout sacrifice, and it was recommended by Peter Nielsen, and an excellent Fritz trainer, or at least I've heard it's excellent. And International Master Ron Burnett recommended it too, or played it, and he lives nearby. I've played him a few times. So what's the idea? The idea is open file against the king. The queen's on an open diagonal. All of black's pieces are included in the attack, and there's the d5 break. So is that scary? Well, practically speaking, it's scary, especially if white doesn't know what he's doing. The main problem is that it doesn't work. And the main reason why, well, there's multiple reasons it doesn't work. there's the old recommendation I gave of h4, which is okay. We're going to get back to this, but I will just add that modern theory suggests g5. I might as well update the course when the videos come out for this, and then either rook d3 with queen d2 and rook b3, or king a1 with rook b1. And white's just much better objectively, and easy to diffuse the attack. Something like this, rook b1, d5, c5, and black just doesn't have enough play. So that's maybe easier than what I recommended before. But I'd like to cover my old theory, h4. By the way, my old theory is old because maybe because h5 is not lost for black, maybe? I mean, obviously I prefer white in these positions, but okay. Or because of bishop 8. I don't want to cover theory moves. If you're a master, you can check it out for yourself with the new engines. I don't need to explain every little detail here. I want to show the ideas, and I want to show the analysis here. So my old analysis goes d5, and this is Nielsen's idea. The idea is the rook comes to the file, and then if takes, you could take with the knight. There's a pin on the open c file. The knight sometimes comes to d6, and so g5, knight e8, takes. Rook b8 is possible, but then you can move the king in either direction. I like king c1 better because it gets off of the open diagonal, and after takes, it's just not sound. I mean, after knight d6, you can just play bishop f4, exchange the knight off, or play c5, and there's plenty of reasons why this just does not work for black. It's more speculative sacrifices that don't hold up to current theory. Okay, so something like this, and king c1 once again is just like I generally prefer to do that. And then you just make exchanges. It's pretty simple. You can afford to give back material on it, but at the end of the day, white is the one with the material advantage, and white king is just as safe as black's king, so it doesn't work. h5 exists too, but after g5, okay, there's lots of, there's different ways to play. White's easily developing all of his pieces. This isn't that difficult. You can move the queen, you can play c3, you can block the long diagonal. White's fine. There's no problems, to say the least. But okay, my old recommendation is okay. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just I don't like how much counterplay black gets. I actually prefer the new idea of just gain a tempo now, play g5 immediately, because for me, h4 makes sense if we have time to play h5 and h takes g6. But if we don't have time for that, because their counterplay is faster, then it's just not the most appropriate move, essentially. And my current opinion is that my old recommendation, h4, is slightly inaccurate, even though white is the one pressing for a win, and that instead you should play g5 to kick the knight before he has time to recapture their, like if he plays knight e8, for example, he blocks the rook, and if the rook comes out first, he gives time for us to move the king out. Also, we can maybe move the rook, exchange, so it's a commitment on black's end. We didn't waste a tempo on h4, and so it's much, much easier to consolidate. I recommend if you're a master trying to really learn the theory that you look in this direction, and you're welcome to try to correct me and ask questions in the notes if you believe that h4 is just as strong as g5. Okay, so let's summarize what we've learned from the dragon here with knight e5. The old main line with knight e5 is unsound. But white is objectively much better, and king b1 prepares all of the ideas with h4 to follow. If black commits to playing knight c4, we're going to play g4, and black has weaknesses. We're going to push the h-pawn and play for mate. If black plays a slow move, like a6 or rook e8, we're going to play h4, we're going to play h5, play Karpov-Korchnoi style, play for checkmate, and it should work. Unless they play h5, but then we have a very strong double pawn sacrifice with g4, h5, and all of our pieces are coming in the attack. And another alternative for black is some sort of b5 sacrifice, which doesn't work because you take it, bring your knight to a3, and black has no targets. Because of this, theory has moved on. Knight e5 is not the strongest move. Black should play either the Topalov Dragon or Anish Giri's new idea with an earlier knight takes d4. Feel free to ask any questions if you have in the comments, and also I welcome anyone to try to challenge my theoretical claims. I'll see you soon in the next chapter.